Hey, so welcome back to Moses' Unexpected Rescue, God's Unexpected Rescue, Part 3. So we're in the third week of our series in Moses. So we started off all together and we looked at the birth of Moses and how God rescued Moses. And Moses got drawn out of the Nile by, who was it? Pharaoh's daughter. And then last week, David preached about the leader with the self-inflicted wound and about how when Moses got a bit older, he did something a bit dumb. And he murdered a guy and then he ran away. And we're going to be catching up with the story from about there. So today's today's sermon, it's not just a story. Today's sermon, I've titled All's Well That Ends Well. And so if you got the email, that's what Margie said this week that we were going to be sharing on. And it'll probably go on the YouTube too. Because I didn't really know what else to call it. So that's what it's called today. And we'll be getting into that really soon. But just before that, I asked you earlier if you'd ever been known by more than one name. Or if you knew somebody else who was, and what was the context of that? So, anybody known by more than one name here?
Everybody started calling me Rosal, and they still do.
Okay, so in the mail room, Rosalie became Rosal, an abbreviation. Nice, it was good. And, I had a number of teachers who taught under their maiden name, even though they were married. So they had these two. Oh, you might have that. Anybody else here though with known by more than one name, or we're all Graham? When he was working in chemistry, they called him G-Force. That is really cool. That's a cool name. Maybe we'll have to start calling you G-Force here at church. That's pretty cool. Anybody else? Okay. So Lynn forced people to change her name because she was born Lynette and didn't like it. Faye. Mum? Faye? Yep, you're known by Mum. Yes, by a specific group of people who think they're the most important people in the world. And to you, maybe they are. Although Rory might disagree. So, if we think about it, we often are called by more than one name. My dad's legal first name is Hugh. But nobody ever calls him that. And so when I was growing up, if anybody came to the door or they rang up and they were looking for Hugh, we knew that they were trying to sell us something because they didn't actually know him. Dad always introduces himself as Dave. And so that's what everyone calls him, except my mum, who calls him David, and his brother, who calls him Bill. And there is a story for that, but I'm not going to tell it. This week's story, the passage we're covering, the place where we are in Exodus, looking at Moses' story, is full of characters who have two names. Most confusingly for me, Moses' father-in-law, one of the characters we're about to meet, has two names. So in the passage we're reading, his name is Reuel. But later in Exodus, we know him as Jethro. So here Moses' father-in-law has two names, Reuel and Jethro. Though often too hard to tell from some English Bibles, the mountain of God, where Moses meets God, where Moses receives the Ten Commandments much later on, even where Elijah runs to much later on in a different part of the Bible altogether. The mountain of God has two names. It's called Horeb and Sinai. Even God has two names. So in this passage, God has two names. There's Elohim or Elohim, which is translated as God in most translations we have, and Yahweh, which is most frequently translated as the Lord in many modern translations, although sometimes it will appear as Yahweh because that's convenient for clarity. And this has made me think of another character that had two names. First, he was given a name by his mother. And this name was quickly lost when his mother had to give him up under the care of a powerful family, who, because it was their privilege and right, gave him a new name. His mother was relatively powerless in how he was brought up, but hoped that his new family would give him an opportunity to flourish, and perhaps that somehow that might help her situation too. His new family gave him not just a new name, but also a very good education with much better prospects than if he had stayed with his mother. But when he was older, he was forced to leave his homeland and become a foreigner in a strange land. Eventually, he married and had a family before one day, when he was much older, he returned to the land of his birth to face the two sides of his heritage. That man was my grandfather. When he arrived in New Zealand, he tried desperately to focus on the Britishness of his name and his education. But while he could deny his mother's name and his mother tongue, and even the ignominy of his date of birth, but that's another story, he could never escape the colour of his mother's skin. Born the son of an English tea plantation manager and a Nepali labourer, he was destined to be a foreigner wherever he lived. And it wasn't until this week that I realised that there were any similarities between Moses' story and my granddad. But this week, I feel like God has given me a bit of a window into how Moses might have felt, or at least how he might have oriented himself in a world where there was no place where he really fit in. Today, I want to talk about how God uses our character, our personality, and our life experiences to prepare us to participate in God's rescue. Last week, David left Moses fleeing to the land of Midian to escape from the wrath of Pharaoh after Moses killed an Egyptian supervisor. And so we're going to pick up the story there in Exodus 2, 15 to 17. When Moses arrived in Midian, he sat down beside a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters who came as usual to draw water and fill the water troughs for their father's flocks. But some other shepherds came and chased them away. So Moses jumped up and rescued the girls from the shepherds. And then he drew water for their flocks. So Moses he's just arrived in Midian. He's got nowhere to stay. He's got no friends or family. He's got no connections. He's actually a wanted man on the run from the most powerful empire in the world. The skill set that he has acquired as a member of the Egyptian royal court was probably not that useful in his new location. And while he has the choice to just sit and mind his own business, Moses just can't help himself. The same righteous anger that got him into so much trouble in Egypt now burns at the well in Midian. And Moses picks a fight where he must have been significantly outnumbered. Now, how many men would it take to chase off 7 hard-working women? Now, all we know that there were shepherds, plural, so more than one. In a quick search, I discovered artwork depicting 3 or 4 or as many as 7 shepherds that Moses is seeing off. Moses is fighting 7 men all at once. He's a superhero. But I reckon that there would have been at least 4 shepherds. And really, my only reason for that is a bit of game theory, actually. I think if the women outnumber the men by better than 2 to 1, they'll find a way to keep the men at bay and water their flocks. But the Bible only tells us that there were shepherds plural. There are at least 2, which still means there are at least twice as many of them than there are of just Moses. And so Moses is picking a fight where he's significantly outnumbered. But at this point in his life, Moses just doesn't know how to keep his hands in his pockets. I don't think that Moses went looking for trouble. It just seemed to have a way of finding him. And regardless of how many shepherds there were, Moses fights them all off and rescues the 7 daughters. God uses our character, personality, and life experiences to prepare us to participate in God's rescue. I suspect that Moses has been given a heart for justice by God. When he witnesses injustice, it stirs a passion within him. That's fantastic. In Egypt, it got him into a lot of trouble. In Midian, it got him into a lot of trouble too. It could have got him killed. But here, God uses this righteous rage to see these women rescued. And things turn out for the best in a way that Moses would never have imagined. Let's continue from Exodus 2:18. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked, "Why are you back so soon today?" "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds," they answered. "And then he drew water for us and watered our flocks." "Then where is he?" their father asked. "Why did you leave him there? Invite him to come and eat with us." Moses accepted the invitation and he settled there with him. In time, Reuel gave Moses his daughter Zipporah to be his wife. Zipporah, not too sure. One of those. I'll probably vary between the two. On his daughter's return, Reuel asks 3 questions. The first question gives us a sense that Moses has stepped into a fight that has been ongoing for quite some time. Why are you back so soon? This indicates that the daughters of Reuel are normally home later because they regularly get chased off by the other shepherds. This implies that they've been systemically targeted for discrimination. I'm not sure if Moses had any idea that that was the case when he intervened. In Exodus chapter 2, he doesn't seem like the kind of guy who asks lots of questions in order to assess the best course of action. Moses is shoot first, ask questions later kind of guy. I don't think he was asking the shepherds, what are you doing? None of that. Then the next 2 questions that Reuel asks come together, hard on the heels of one another. Then where is he? And why did you leave him there? They show that Reuel thought Moses was at least worthy of an invitation home to say, thank you. Now, did Reuel think that Moses might have been a long-term solution to this shepherd abuse issue? Maybe. Maybe not. Did Reuel think that Moses might have been a long-term marriage partner for one of his daughters? Maybe, but probably not. Moses' actions get him protection and connection, food, shelter, and eventually a family. Now, in the process, Moses becomes another member of the founder wife at the well club. So a man goes on a journey, he meets a beautiful woman at the well, there's some kind of interaction, water is drawn and animals all get a drink. Sometime later, the woman becomes a bride. And so this happened first for Isaac and Rebekah, and then it happened for Jacob and Rachel, and now for Moses and Zipporah. And I talked about the affirming / scandalous allusion to this and these images with Jesus and the woman at the well in John chapter 4 last year. And if you missed that, you can find it on YouTube and watch it again. With the rescue of Reuel's daughters, Moses begins several life-changing relationships with Reuel and with Zipporah, which eventually give him greatly needed experience for his most famous role in the future. If you're not sure what that is, just keep coming back to church and we'll eventually get there. It's got some cool, scary plagues and some big water stuff happening. It's all going to come. You'll see. With the invitation into Reuel's home, with a place to stay, food and shelter, and a job, it seems, and eventually a whole new family, there is a real sense that Moses is rescued too through this interaction. God uses our character, our personality, and life experiences to prepare us to participate in God's rescue. Before we move on, I just want to draw back to something that David mentioned last week. He talked about choosing our identity. Moses chose to identify with the oppressed in Egypt, and it got him into trouble. And here in Midian, once more, Moses chooses to identify with the oppressed, and it gets him another adoptive family. But even as he had chosen to identify with the Hebrews in Egypt, look at when Reuel's daughters tell their father about Moses. How do they identify him? They say, an Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. Reuel's daughters see Moses as an Egyptian. Moses might have picked his side, but he still bore the marks of a man raised in the royal court of Egypt. He might have been a Hebrew by birth, but in the words of the Bangles, he still walked like an Egyptian. He would have still talked like an Egyptian and dressed like an Egyptian. Even though he had chosen to identify as a Hebrew, he was now in a lot of trouble. And as a result of that, to outsiders, he still very much appeared to be an Egyptian. God can rescue us from the power of sin and death in an instant. Our identity is changed as soon as we decide to follow Jesus. But sometimes the impacts of our sin can be long-lasting. The habits we have formed can take time and effort to change. Becoming the person that God intends us to be can take a lifetime. But God will still use us. The Moses that we find at the well in Midian is essentially the very same man who killed the Egyptian supervisor a few verses earlier. No time has really passed. He's the same guy, just stripped of his privilege and security and honor. And yet there, at perhaps Moses' lowest point, God uses Moses in that moment to rescue a family from systemic oppression. Does that make him ready to rescue his own family, the nation of Israel, from systemic oppression? I don't think so. Just as God uses Moses to rescue others to the extent that he is ready to be used by God, God uses us to rescue others to the extent that we are ready to be used by God. And if we are open to God using us to rescue others, then as God uses us, God prepares us to participate in God's rescue more and more. You know, before we went to Cambodia with servants, Sue and I had done a couple of 2 or 3 week trips to Cambodia, Thailand and Laos. And we got to do some really cool things. And we did some other things that make some pretty cool stories. And you've probably heard some of those, and some I'll try not to ever tell you. But, when the case comes along for an embarrassing story, I'll probably bring some of them up. Anyway, in the process of that, God was at work preparing us to go for a little longer. And so then when we went with servants, we got to do some amazing things. But even so, God was at work in us. And what God was doing in us through that time was just as significant, perhaps even more so than what we were able to do. God uses our character, personality, and life experiences to prepare us to participate in God's rescue. Exodus 22 to 25 says, later she, that's Zipporah, gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, for he explained, I have been a foreigner in a foreign land. Years passed, and the king of Egypt died, but the Israelites continued to groan under their burden of slavery. They cried out for help, and their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he looked down on the people of Israel, and he knew it was time to act. So, if this was a movie about the life of Moses, this would have been the music montage piece of Moses tending sheep and Zipporah having children and Gershom and Eliezer, which is the second son that they had that's not mentioned in this passage but is mentioned later on, but showing them growing up, And we take our cues that this is going on by the words in time in verse 21 and later in verse 22 and years past in verse 23. Now we're just about to arrive at the burning bush, the place where the self-revealing God is made known to Moses. How old is Moses when he meets God at the burning bush? Anyone want to hazard a guess? How old is Moses at the burning bush? Anyone over here want to guess? 86? 60? Anybody else? 68. We're guessing here because we didn't. What, you're having another guess? What's your guess now? 42. He's just going. 140. Oh, that's a big number. Anybody else? So he dies at 120. So it's probably not going to be 140. He's 80. 80 years old. At 80 years old, God appears to Moses and calls him to go and rescue his people. So there's just one chapter in the Bible that covers the first 80 years of Moses' life. And then there are 135 chapters that cover his life from the age of 80 to his death at 120. So there are a number of people in our congregation here today who are either in their late 80s or late 70s or early 80s. So you're about the age. In fact, there's one person here who is 80, but I'm not going to point you out, and you're not going to look around thinking who it is. There's a number of you here who are pretty close to Moses' age when he gets to the burning bush. And if I were to tell you that God had spent all this time preparing you for your most significant role, would you believe me? I wouldn't believe me. I suspect that you would need a burning bush type sign too. Moses gets one in the next chapter. We'll get there next week. But in just 24 verses, we see the shaping events of Moses' life. He was born a Hebrew, condemned to die, miraculously saved, initially raised by his mother. God rescued Moses from certain death. He becomes a symbol of hope, and he learns his identity as a Hebrew. Then he's raised in the palace of Pharaoh. God rescues Moses from a life of slavery, and he learns the systems of the royal court. He learns how the things work on the inside of Pharaoh's palace. Then he takes matters into his own hands. He becomes a wanted murderer. God rescues Moses from the wrath of Pharaoh. And Moses learns that taking things by force through our own might could be asking for trouble. Then Moses finds a family through a fight at the well. God uses Moses to rescue the daughters of Reuel. Moses learns to give and receive hospitality, and he learns to be a husband and a father. And then, living a much simpler life in the wilderness, Moses forges a new career as a shepherd, and he learns about life at the edge of civilization, how to move at the pace of the weak and vulnerable. And perhaps God rescues Moses from himself. All of these things God has taken and woven together in Moses' life. And all of these things are going to be incredibly useful for what God has in store for Moses and the people of Israel in the coming 40 years. God uses our character, personality, and life experiences to prepare us to participate in God's rescue. 2 weeks ago, we saw that Moses' mum saw that he was a special baby. And I bet she told him he was a special baby every chance she got. You're such a special boy. You're such a special young man. God rescued you, and God has big plans for you. Perhaps God will use you to deliver our people. No pressure, though. And perhaps even growing up, Pharaoh's daughter would have told him similar things. You are such a special boy. I found you floating down the Nile, and I drew you out of the water. Perhaps the gods will use you for something special. But 8 decades later, I suspect that Moses had given up on all his dreams of specialness. Those who had hoped his miraculous rescue would eventually lead to their rescue too had probably given up hope. Or perhaps they'd even died. Why does God wait so long to act? Why do entire generations of God's chosen people grow up and die in slavery in Egypt? Is it because God takes that long to notice? Despite what the words say in Exodus, I don't think so. I believe that the God who knows every hair on our head, both of mine, and counts every tear that we shed, sees all of our pain, all of our suffering, and the pain and suffering of those around us. God hears every nasty word spoken of us, every mean thing done to us, every injustice carried out against us. I don't know why it might take God so long to act. But here in the story of Exodus, 2 things do spring to mind. The first thought is that the people of Israel have to be ready to leave. If the oppression lasts only a short time, people will say, perhaps it's just a blip. Maybe it will get better. For an entire people to get to the point where they are ready to leave their lives behind and risk it all, an uncertain future somewhere out in the desert, requires a certain amount of entrenched oppression. The second thought is that God needs a leader who understands just how Egyptian the people actually are and how hard it is for all that Egyptianness to be removed from their lives. Now, whether Moses has spent 30, 40, 50, or 60 years in Midian, he is significantly different when God sends him back to Egypt to rescue the Israelites. Once the people are ready to go, getting them out of Egypt doesn't take that long. But getting Egypt out of the people takes much longer. God needed a leader who understood that experience and would have compassion on them as a result. Beyond all that, I know that God's timing is perfect. I'm glad that God is far more patient with me than I could ever deserve. That often means that I'm far more inclined to get impatient with God than the other way around. Moses' illusions of grandeur had probably ended when he was on the run as a murderer. I wonder if the weight of responsibility ever truly went away. But I suspect that by the time God had decided it was time to act, Moses had learned that he's not capable of rescuing the people of Israel, which is essential for him to know. At the well, Moses isn't ready for God's great big rescue of the nation of Israel. But God still uses him to participate in God's rescue in a perhaps smaller, but just as meaningful way for those whom he rescued. And it had a similar impact on his life. God invites us to join in doing things that only God can do. God uses our character, personality, and life experiences to prepare us to participate in God's rescue. This is my granddad's Bible. It's a teacher's edition. It has a concordance. It has a Bible dictionary. It has background information on the ancient Near East. It has dozens of photographic images and notes on all sorts of topics that might have been considered useful for preparing sermons 100 years ago. This picture here is one of my favourite ones, and one of my dad's favourite ones too. The little caption says it's a water carrier. He's carrying water there in a dead pig skin. And yet this image, of all the images I've ever seen, communicates what Jesus talks about wine, new wine and new wineskins better than any other image I've ever seen. And if I ever get around to preaching on that passage, I might bring that picture back again. And of course, Granddad's Bible also has maps. Wonderful. At the front of this Bible is this inscription: to Hugh Muspratt, on leaving home, with all good wishes from the St. Andrew's Colonial Homes, J. A. Graham, Home Superintendent, Kalimpong, Bengal, 1st October 1923. My granddad was 18 and a half years old. I don't know if he ever read his Bible, this Bible. As far as I know, after growing up in a missionary school, being sent to New Zealand to live with a Christian family, marrying a devout Presbyterian, and having children and grandchildren who have served God in New Zealand and overseas, he died still considering himself a heathen. I don't know if he ever understood himself to be rescued by God. But I'm pretty sure he never considered himself part of God's rescue. And yet without him, without his story, I wouldn't be here. Every single one of us have in some way experienced God's rescue. Every single person who experiences God's rescue is invited to participate in God's rescue, no matter how qualified or unqualified we might feel we are. God uses our character, personality, and life experiences to prepare us to participate in God's rescue. As we finish, I have a final question for us to discuss. How might God be calling you to participate in God's rescue right now? I know it's a bit of a scary question, and you don't have to have all the answers today, but it'd be great if you can spend a few moments talking about it and then ponder it as you leave. You know, it might be as simple as getting our Arotahi Renew Together money in, or helping to support Faye on her mission trip. Or perhaps it might be volunteering for the social supermarket. Last time I checked, they were still looking for a volunteer for Monday afternoons. Maybe it's to invite someone home for a meal, like Ruel did. Or maybe it's to advocate for someone in need, like Moses did. Or even help out with someone's animals, like Moses also did. You might be waiting for God's great big rescue. But that in no way needs to prevent you from participating in God's unexpected rescue in meaningful ways while you wait by the well. Let's pray. Lord God, I thank you for your word. I thank you for what it shows us, what it reveals to us. Jesus, I thank you for the story of Moses. There is so much of our faith that rests on these actions. Lord, the way you reveal yourself to Moses, the way you deliver the people of Israel. Lord, the way that they foretell our ultimate rescue in Jesus coming to earth to rescue us because we could never do it on our own. Jesus, we thank you that you promise to rescue us, not just spiritually, not just saving us from our sins, and that you promise also to come again to take us to be with you. But you also promise to rescue us and meet us in our need where we are. And Lord, for some of us, we are still crying out for your rescue. And yet, Lord, even in the midst of that, you invite us to participate in your rescue. God, I pray that you would help us to hear your gentle whisper, your invitation to join you in seeing your rescue enacted in every part of our world, in every part of our lives, in every part of our community. Amen. That concludes the sermon. Please stay, have a chat with the people you're sitting with around the question that Phil's taken away from me. There, it's back again. Please stay for a tea and coffee. If you do need to vote regarding the budget and you can't do it online, please come and fill out a form up front here. Otherwise, if I don't manage to catch up with you over tea, have a fantastic week. May you know God's blessing upon your life this week, and may you be sensitive to God's leading and prompting to participate in God's rescue. God bless.